Good evening, everyone. My name is Cassandra Cavness, and I am the Development Assistant for the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts. We are so happy that you are able to join us here today for our creative conversation, The History of Lynching, with artist Bethany Collins, Deputy Director of Community Education, Kiara Boone, with the Equal Justice Initiative, Dr. Darren Mouton, who is the chair of the History and Political Science Department at Alabama State University, and Dr. Joan Harrell, who is a journalism lecturer and diversity coordinator for Auburn University School of Communication and Journalism. Tonight's event is sure to be powerful and impactful. We're going to have a great conversation regarding lynching, regarding Bethany's work that deals with lynching in a variety of ways, and lynching more generally. And we're going to have a few minutes for each of them to introduce themselves. Then we're going to have a moderated discussion for about 30 minutes. And at the end, we're going to have a Q&A. And that is where I'm going to bring all of your audience questions into the conversation. So I really hope that you guys are active and engaged and writing your comments and questions in the Facebook chat, because I will be checking those and I will be adding them to the conversation as we go along. So first up is going to be Bethany. So if you would like to go ahead and share your screen.
Sure. Well, it's really nice to be here with you guys, well, even from a distance. And I'm looking forward to sharing the work, but then mostly just to hearing my fellow panelists talk about their expertise. So I wanted to share two works that are at the heart of the exhibition at the Montgomery Museum of Fine Art, and that also both are made after the 2016 presidential election, just to put them in context. So this work is America, a Hymnal. It sits at the heart of this chapel-like space that was constructed at the museum. And it's an artist book made up of 100 versions of My Country 'Tis of Thee that were written from the 18th to 20th centuries. So this used to be a much more common early American practice, where the assumption is if we all know the tune, then I can keep the melody consistent and rewrite the lyrics for different social political causes. So the book is made up of 100 versions of My Country 'Tis of Thee. The tune stays constant, but the lyrics are rewritten for the suffrage movement, labor, temperance, lots of prohibitionist versions. But also the Confederacy has their versions, as does the Union Army, and as do abolitionists, right? So together, all like bound together forever, are 100 dissenting versions of what it means to be American. I burned the musical notes away because that's what's holding the book together and these dissenting versions together, and left the lyrics legible. Forever, they just have to abide one another in contradiction. So that sits at the heart of this chapel-like space, and it's surrounded by My Destiny Is in Your Hands. So this work is based on florography, the language of flowers. It's a little hard to see, but behind the hymnal is actually this white on white flocked wallpaper called My Destiny Is in Your Hands. So flocked wallpaper, that used to be much more common and popular. It's less so today, except in like DIY settings. But it's kind of like a velvety, crushed velvet-like fabric material that creates a pattern on top of the wallpaper. So if you can see behind the book, I'll get a little bit closer here in this detail, is actually these images of flowers that are made out of that flocking. So the work is based on florography, the language of flowers. I think in the late 19th century, there were at least like 98 flower dictionaries in circulation in the US. And the idea was that it would make these covert messages, things that were difficult to speak aloud, a little bit easier if you could send it through a bouquet and then translate it with your own personal flower dictionary. That's the idea. For my work then, what I did was pull images of official state flowers. So official flowers from across the American South. And then I paired them with images of official flowers, state flowers, for states along the Great Migration route, so the 3 tributaries. And in particular, I emphasized the states where my family left the South, that second wave of the Great Migration. So they translate into this kind of poem, this kind of love letter to the South. For instance, Delaware is the peach blossom, I think. Its translation is, I am your captive. Louisiana's iris means I burn for you. Alabama's camellia is my destiny is in your hands. It's like love letter and in relationship to the South, because these are our official state flowers. Their translations start to reveal the kind of violent history of the American South and also then the nation, right? I am your captive becomes differently translated through that history of the American South. The dimensions for the work, so the piece has been shown in a couple different places, so it can have different configurations, but it must always cover 800 to 900 square feet of space, and that's intentional because I want there always to be 300 camellia petals present. Camellia is Alabama's state flower. 300 camellia petals then to memorialize the number of lynchings in Alabama post-Reconstruction. It is equal parts love letter, right? My destiny is in your hands. I burn for you, justice, welcome me, let me go. These are some of those translations that emerge from this kind of poem to the South and to my place of my home state. It is equal parts love letter and indictment at the same time. Both the hymnal and the wallpaper for me, especially coming after the 2016 presidential election, were very much about trying to figure out a way to evoke that feeling of home. What does it mean to belong to a place that doesn't always claim you back? And that feeling of a place that can be simultaneously welcoming and estranging, both at the same time. So I'll stop there and turn it over. Oh, let me stop sharing my screen too.
Thank you, Bethany. That was wonderful. Kiara?
Good evening, everyone. Had to remind myself to take myself off of mute. My name is Kiara Boone. I'm the Deputy Director of Community Education at the Equal Justice Initiative. And for our conversation this evening, I thought it might be helpful to just provide a little bit of background about EJI and about our racial justice projects and the cultural sites that we recently opened a few years ago here in Montgomery. So as a law office, the Equal Justice Initiative has been dedicated to representing clients sentenced to death and condemned to die in prison for more than 30 years. That's really how our organization got our start at a time when Alabama had one of the highest death sentencing and execution rates in the nation. Since that time, our work has expanded to challenging conditions of confinement in prisons, challenging inhumane conditions of confinement, working to expose racial bias in the criminal justice system. And our work in this traditional criminal justice advocacy space has really given us proximity to really witness the ways in which our history of racial and economic injustice have informed this current era of mass incarceration, and really the palpable links between racial terror lynching and the death penalty. I think it's really compelling that we're having this conversation this evening on the day that Virginia, the first Southern state to abolish the death penalty, went into effect earlier today, and I hope that that can be a part of our discussion this afternoon. But this proximity to the work and understanding the connection to the history was really planted the seed for EJI to begin thinking about what a more productive conversation around justice could look like if it was informed by this historical context and the links and evolutions of the history of racial injustice from slavery to mass incarceration. And so one of the many tasks that we've done is to sort of deepen that research and to produce it into accessible forms for the public in reports and websites and curriculum, and of course, these cultural sites in Montgomery. For the research into racial terror lynching, EJI lawyers and researchers spent several years going through newspaper archives, visiting communities to interview residents who had experienced this or who had heard these stories passed down from family members. And beyond just counting the number of documented racial terror lynchings, we really wanted this project to also examine and amplify the ways in which this racial terror violence impacted the entire Black community and what those legacies look like even today. And so in 2015, we released our report, Lynching in America, Confronting the Legacy of Racial Terror, where we documented more than 4,400 victims of racial terror violence post-Reconstruction. Last summer, we released a report on Reconstruction era violence that really has expanded that number to more than 6,500 Black victims of racial terror violence throughout this nation. And this is not just in the states of the former Confederacy, but also 300 additional racial terror lynchings beyond the South as well. So this really becomes an opportunity for us as a nation to engage with understanding how this mass violence was carried out and how that impacted families and communities at that time, but also what it means for us today and how it continues to shape our future. Recognizing that this era of racial terror violence was really characterized by fear and silence in a lot of ways, we wanted to create a space or spaces that really amplify the historical context of this history, but also provided an opportunity to educate people about those experiences. So the Legacy Museum, From Enslavement to Mass Incarceration, is intended to be a space where we make that the argument about the link from the past to the present in very explicit terms, using narrative accounts, first-person accounts from people who were enslaved, from people who were lynched, whose family members were lynched, people who lived through Jim Crow segregation, and of course, the era of mass incarceration. Inside the Legacy Museum, you see all types of exhibits and storytelling, and if you haven't had a chance to visit, please consider this your personal invitation to do so. One of the exhibits inside the museum is the soil collection exhibit, and these are jars of soil collected from lynching sites across the country that represent people who were lynched. They have the name of the person who was lynched, the date that it occurred, and the community where it happened. And EJI has invited community members, family members, to really participate in this tangible effort of truth telling by collecting this soil. And when you see the soil together in the exhibit, I think it's really powerful because it begins to tell a story of a community's history and community defined as our whole nation. And then again, really trying to reiterate the link between the past to the present and giving people an opportunity to dive deep into that. So these are letters from some of our clients that you see on the wall, as well as an opportunity to listen to some of our formerly incarcerated clients tell those stories. A short walk from the museum is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which sits on about 6 acres of land and is dedicated to telling the stories and amplifying this history of the more than 6,500 victims of racial terror violence. When you enter the site, it sits on top of a hill and you see these monuments that represent the over 800 counties where we've documented these racial terror lynchings. Similar to the museum, we want the memorial to be a narrative space and for people to be able to make those links from the different eras of time that are documented in order to understand how thousands of people were lynched and racial terror violence was rampant. We have to understand how the history of slavery and the dehumanization of Black lives began there in order to set the foundation for this violence to occur. And so this is a sculpture by a Ghanaian artist named Kwame Akoto Bamfu that is really powerful in the ways in which it dramatizes the institution of slavery, but also the brutality and humanity of those who were enslaved. The memorial has been, we hope, and it continues to be a space where family members and community members can come to reckon with this history in really powerful ways. We've heard numerous stories and accounts from family members or community members who didn't know that this history happened in their community, and this has been a space for them to deepen that learning, to do some genealogical research, and really to begin to unpack what this history means in very personal and individual ways, in addition to the communal ways as well. The memorial itself is intended to be completely immersive. And so the monuments move and shift and they completely become suspended above you. And even as you're encountering this, we wanted there to be opportunities to learn some of the reasons given why people were lynched, everything from violating social transgressions to trying to register to vote, to just being. And that becomes a part of the narrative experience as well. We wanted this to be a space that not only recognized the documented racial terror lynchings, but also understood that that's just the lynchings, that those are just the victims that we can know. And we recognize that there are many numerous stories that we can't, and that this space not only talks about those who lost their lives, but those who were traumatized and intimidated by this fear. One of the other things that we know about this era is that it forced the migration of Black people from the South to communities in the Midwest and Northeast and out West, and really challenged their opportunity for equality when they got there, facing redlining and housing discrimination and employment discrimination as well. Part of the memorial and the museum and this racial justice narrative work is a call to action, which we have been talking about in terms of our community remembrance project, where we invite communities to take the experience of engaging with this narrative back to their local communities through soil collections and other projects. This is are images of communities in Maryland and Mississippi who have participated in these, and it becomes an opportunity to have a tangible experience of reckoning with this. And then these jars of soil become part of the exhibit in Montgomery and parts of local exhibits in community, where there's an opportunity to have, again, that proximity to this history and that ongoing learning and engagement. And then also the narrative historical markers. These markers are really powerful in that they challenge communities to really reckon with language in ways that name white supremacy, that name racial terror lynching, that tell the stories of lynching victims that oftentimes whose narratives aren't told. And it also contextualizes it into this national narrative as well. And when we do these marker ceremonies, it becomes a chance for a permanent documentation of this history to become a part of the community, but also space for communities to gather and to have a place in their community for ongoing reckoning. So that's just a hopefully quick overview of our projects, our research, and how we think about how this history is still relevant in shaping our present and our future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kiara. We're gonna switch over now and have Dr. Moten introduce himself a little bit.
Good evening. My name is Derryn Moten. I am the chair of the Department of History and Political Science at Alabama State University. This evening, we're going to have a conversation about lynching. And so I want to provide a context that is taken from my time as a graduate student at the University of Iowa. I studied an execution that occurred at Camp Dodge, Iowa, during the First World War. This is significant, or I should say that war is significant for African-American history in several ways. This was the first war that African-American men were drafted into military service. This was the first war where the United States government created two segregated battle divisions, the 92nd Division and the 93rd Division. Four of those, or I should say three of the all the draftees from, Black draftees from Alabama trained at Camp Dodge. Three of those draftees arrived at camp in 1918. And in the spring of 1918, were court-martialed for the rape of a 17-year-old white girl from Des Moines, Iowa. The names of those draftees were Fred Allen, Stanley Tramble, and Robert Johnson. They were found guilty of having committed rape, which was during wartime, an offense that called for the death penalty. The three soldiers, these three soldiers, were hanged together. And so they were hanged simultaneously. What is odd about this execution is that the commanders at Camp Dodge, Iowa, required all the Black soldiers at Camp Dodge to witness the execution. And so these soldiers who were at the camp were ordered to appear at the parade grounds on the 5th of July, 1918, and witnessed the execution of these three men. There were some newspapers that referred to this execution, this military execution, as a lynching because of the alleged crime that had been committed by these three soldiers. The last soldier to die took 45 minutes. And so one of the things that, and I like to tell this story because one of the things that we should know about hangings as well as lynchings is that people didn't die quickly. And so during the 45 minutes that this soldier literally asphyxiated, the other Black soldiers who were ordered to stand at attention had to stand there and watch him and listen to him gurgle and struggle as he slowly died. This execution was the first military execution in Iowa history. This was the only execution in Iowa history for a crime other than murder. And so I tell this story because this story tells us a lot about lynchings in the United States and the supposed reason why many African-American men were lynched. And we will talk about that a lot more later on in our conversation. But the story of these three soldiers at Camp Dodge, Iowa, I think is a good example of something called legal lynchings. And legal lynchings were those executions that occurred under the sort of auspices of the law, of legal authorities, but were carried out with the same type of racism that mob lynchings were carried out.
Thank you, Dr. Moten. That's very powerful story and one that I think sets a good tone for this conversation going forward. Joan, if you want to introduce yourself a little bit.
You're on mute.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm joining this conversation as a, well, now I'm a freelance journalist who has spent time, even before joining the academic family, if you will, spending time talking with descendants of people who were lynched, as well as interviewing persons, unfortunately, who witness current day, starting in the 20th century up to now, 21st century lynchings, executions, as well as I am a descendant of a cousin who was illegally killed, murdered, because he was wrongly accused of committing a crime. And so with that said, I'd like to bring to the conversation, starting out within the context of this is Women's History Month, and I'd like to share with you this photograph. Perhaps some of you have seen this photograph before. This is an unnamed child, a girl child, Black child, who was kept in a zoo in Belgium for the duration of her life, as well as she was fed by people who would treat her as an animal because she is colorized Black and not considered human. And I intersect the work that I do with history, with real lived experiences, and the impact that negative media images, as well as negative media propaganda. Perhaps some of you will refer to it as fake news, but it is propaganda that leads to the murder of innocent people. And I also introduce into the conversation, which Kiara and Dr. Moten mentioned, the fact of the Lynch law, which is named after Charles Lynch, who was a Virginia planter. And interesting enough, he was also a justice of the peace, a law enforcement officer during that period of time when it was legal. And the question is it still legal to lynch, to execute, to murder persons, Black people, persons of color? And so it is within this context that we take into the consideration that also, if you can see the screen here of the book that I'm holding up, Ida B. Wells Barnett introduced to the public domain in 1895, 126 years ago, the Red Record, tabulated statistics and alleged causes of lynchings in the United States. This is still considered a seminal work. It's a collection of tabulated lynchings of Black men, women, and children days after slavery. However, her work is collected and reported, if you will. She was, because of her experience of losing a friend to lynching, as well as members of the community of descendants of slaves during that time period in the late 1800s. And although she reported, collected and researched information on her own, because she was a writer in the Black press, her work she did not feel comfortable with because of structural racism. She was able to, basically, she had to parallel and wait to a great extent, wait until the Chicago Tribune published the records of the men, women, and children who had been lynched across the United States. Although Ida B. Wells Barnett, who worked for the Chicago Defender, the Black newspaper in Chicago, although those lynchings were being tabulated and properly, accurately reported, she had to wait on the majority press, the white-owned press, to confirm before the world, so to speak, began to take a critical look at what was happening with regards to lynching. And so I also like to introduce in this conversation the fact that here we are as of February of last year, 2020, we're only, this is the third month of 2021. So after 120 years, when the first anti-lynching slavery law was introduced in the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate, we still find ourselves just a year ago that our nation, if you will, the United States of America, is still questioning if there should be an anti-lynching law. It was passed, but however, there are members of the United States Congress, as well as the United States Senate today, who voted against the anti-lynching law. In addition, we also take into consideration that just hours ago, if you will, days ago, that 6 Asian women were murdered. 1 woman of European descent, as well as a man of European descent. They were murdered, they were killed, they were executed, if you will, by gun violence at an Asian-owned spa. And it is within that context that a United States Congressman, Chip Roy, felt comfortable introducing into a committee, into a public domain where the committee was there to listen to the Asian members of the United States Congress about, this is a day after, the hours after, if you will, the shooting, I'm going to refer to it as the lynching by gunfire, if you will, if I can introduce that to our conversation, of 6 women, 6 people of color. And when the Asian, this was a committee meeting to discuss the violence against people of color. And so the United States Congressman, Chip Roy, felt comfortable in this climate wherein I'm going to posit that the act of lynching is still accepted. The act of murdering people who are considered the other is still accepted. And he stated that there are old sayings in Texas about finding a rope in Texas, getting a tall oak tree. We take justice very seriously, and we ought to do that. And it is within that same statement that the US Congressman went on to refer to COVID-19 as the China virus. I'd also like to introduce to our conversation the fact that in just last year, that there were 2 men in California, 2 Black men who were found hanging from a tree. The cases have not been resolved. However, the law enforcement officers are declaring their loss of life as suicide. However, members of their family and communities do not believe that the men hung themselves from a tree because they were depressed or because of mental illness. Family members believe, and still it has not been proven, that their loss of life was due to suicide. And so it is at this point, I would like to also introduce to our discussion the noted song by Billie Holiday, which most of us are familiar with. If not, I just would like to introduce it to our discussion, because a tree is a plant, a perennial plant. And Billie Holiday, her true life story, if you will, is being presented on I believe it's, yes, on Amazon Prime. And Billie Holiday, it has been recently reported that she is, her life, even though the media presented her as being a drug addict, but the truth of the matter is that her life was always being threatened and demeaned and questioned, as well as false narratives were created around her life because of the song Strange Fruit. So Bethany, I began this conversation asking you, within the context of the tree being a perennial plant, the largest plant, if you will, depending on the size of the tree, what inspired you to take a critical look at the meaning, as you share, the meaning of the Southern states plants? And did you receive any inspiration from Strange Fruit? Did that come within your musing, if you will? Can you share more in your development and how there is this intersectionality of art, music, and plant life, if you will?
I was on mute. I think after I heard someone say right after the 2016 election is that in times of crisis, our thoughts turn towards home. Like if we can't get there physically, in mind, we turn towards home. So I'm originally from Alabama, and my sense of home is a place that is as equally beautiful as it is violent, you know, and that it's like, it has as many good memories. Well, probably it has as many good memories as bad. And so I was trying to find a way to say that the landscape can look two ways depending on your perspective, that it can be beautiful and violent, and it can be simultaneous. And the camellia then, I think I started with the camellia and kind of branched out from there. So I moved to Chicago maybe 4 or 5, maybe 6 years ago now. And so I was also thinking about, you know, how to make that relationship, that it's not, I thought I just moved to Chicago, that it's actually that there have been tributaries of people who've made that trek before me, and that the landscape comes into that conversation as well, because when we left the South, like we collectively, we not only changed, there's a really nice quote on EJI's page about this, that we not only just changed the Southern landscape metaphorically, we also like changed the rest of the nation, that where we rooted ourselves changed everywhere we planted, everywhere we made new homes. And so our leaving and our arriving, I wanted to find a way to make that metaphor and to make that visual, and floriography felt like a really good way to speak to that. But it's also part of it was that this idea that to say something through flowers made it easier to speak a kind of secret or something that had been silenced, that you could send a bouquet and someone could translate it on their own, and kind of release that secret, or release it into the world. And that felt like an interesting way to think about my relationship to home as well. It was all of those things at the same time. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so within that context of life, the reality of being in Alabama, being in this world where we are still experiencing the execution of persons who are considered the other. Dr. Moten, would you expound more on early on in preparation for our conversation? You talked about the fact that lynching is murder.
Well, yeah. And so the example I often use in class is the murder of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old kid from Chicago who had gone south to Mississippi to visit his relatives, and reportedly made an offensive remark to a white woman. We don't know what Emmett Till actually said to that woman. We do know what happened to Emmett Till. And so when Mississippi, the state of Mississippi, was forced to basically return his remains to his mother, because Mississippi had buried him. She insisted on an open casket funeral. Jet Magazine, a Johnson publication, featured the photos of Emmett Till's corpse. It was the first time an American magazine had featured such photos. Jet Magazine did something else that was important. Jet Magazine referred to Emmett Till's death as a lynching, even though he was not lynched in the conventional fashion. But Jet Magazine reasoned that Emmett Till's death was a lynching because it was a racial murder. And as an aside, years ago, I was talking to one of my classes about the Emmett Till murder. And I asked them if any of them had seen the photos. Now, this is pre-cell phones. So, they couldn't Google. So I literally marched the class over to the library. I asked the librarian for the microfilm reel that had the August, I believe, 1955 issue of Jet magazine. So we loaded it on the reel, on the machine, their microfiche reader printer. And it was one of those reader printers where the image does not appear instantly. It fades in. And so it becomes clearer and clearer as it comes in. And so my students were all leaning towards the screen, waiting for this image to appear. And as it became more visible, they all reared back because they were, needless to say, shocked by what they saw. My father was a young man and went to Emmett Till's funeral and said, because I grew up in Gary, Indiana, 23 miles from Chicago, and said that people were so angry they could barely contain themselves. Something else I want to say in connection to Emmett Till. I said we don't know what he said to this lady. My father, this same person who had gone to, who had attended Emmett Till's funeral, told this story of his mother, my grandmother, instructing him as a young kid, 7, 8, 9 years old. Whenever he spoke to a white woman, he was to look at his shoes. And I can't think about Emmett Till without thinking about the story that my father told, or about his mother instructing him to look at his shoes, because even for a Black male child to make eye contact with a white woman was an offense great enough that young Black child could be murdered.
And it is within you affirm the fact that it was the Black press, if you will, Jet magazine, that told the truth, the whole story, and revealed what a lynching, what it looks like, what the human body, it reveals the torture, the mutilation, the degradation, the dehumanization, and it was the Black press.
Yes, and former Representative Charles Diggs from Michigan, who was a licensed mortician, was part of the effort that compelled the state of Mississippi to return Emmett Till's body to Chicago, because Mississippi had no intentions of that young boy's remains ever leaving Mississippi. And the thing that haunts me to this day, and I mean this sincerely, is why in the world did Mose Wright not put that boy in a car and get him out of Mississippi?
Yeah.
Because there was not a question of whether or not men would have come looking for him. It was a question of when they would look for him and when they would put their hands on him. And the fact that he was a juvenile, he was a kid, meant nothing to these men. He was shot twice through the head with a .45 caliber pistol. His head had swollen to 4 times its normal size. His mother said that when she saw his remains, one of his eyes was resting on his cheekbone. The coroner said that when he looked through one side of his head, he could see clearly through the other side of his head. And we have to remember this was done to a child.
Yes.
And I think what lynchings teaches us is that you weren't too old, you weren't too young. It didn't matter if you were female. It didn't matter whether or not you were male. It didn't matter whether or not you were pregnant. We have stories of women who were pregnant and having their babies cut out of their stomachs, and the lynch mob stomping the fetus to death. This has to be one of the darkest periods of history in our young country. And I am internally grateful to EJI for having the Memorial for Peace and Justice, because we should never, ever forget what happened. Never.
Yes. And great segue. I was going to go from you to Ms. Boone. Again, another evidence, if you will, within the context of, if you remember, I posited that it is because of the Black truth tellers. Ida B. Wells telling the story, reporting the first of the lynchings here in the Red Record, and within the context of a man of African descent, a descendant of slaves, Brian Stevenson, starting EJI, and the work continues. Ms. Boone, if you would, please unpack for us, you shared with us the collection of the soils and how the research started to gather the names of the men and women who we saw and we see, if you have not been able to visit at the memorial. Talk more about the current day parallels of lynchings.
Yeah, as I was sitting here listening to you all talk about Strange Fruit and Emmett Till, I was thinking about the poem that was turned into this beautiful song by Billie Holiday and has been performed by others, that was inspired by the 1930 lynching of Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith in Gary County, Indiana, Marion, Indiana. These were two 19-year-olds who were lynched on the courthouse lawn in that community. A third young boy was 16 and who was beaten nearly to death, but survived. And it was the image of that public spectacle lynching that inspired that poetry that captured so much of the violence that had been permeating this country at that time. And because of the just the impunity that these mobs operated in, no fear of retaliation or accountability or consequence, they were often posing for photographs with the remains, with these lifeless bodies. The bodies of Mr. Shipp and Mr. Smith were left on display for hours in front of thousands of people. And that's something that we've seen documented in numerous accounts. And the lynchings of these teenagers and the murder and killing of Emmett Till, it reminds me of the connections to racial terror violence and the criminal justice system and the carceral state. One of the things that we try to do with our research and the museum and the memorial is really to expand how people think about lynching, the definition, first of all. It's not just hanging. We think of lynching as all the modes in which we carry out that racial terror violence. And so all the ways in which people can be harmed, that is covered under that umbrella of racial terror lynching and these extrajudicial killings. But this conversation tonight is making me think of George Stenney, who was 14 years old when he was executed by the state of South Carolina in 1944, also during this era of racial terror violence, and using the facade of justice, having a trial, having a conviction and a sentence, but still carrying out something that was completely not just, and the impact that that had on that community, his family, and taking that very young life. That was such a model of what we had seen with the outdoor extrajudicial killings of young Black people, young Black men. About a quarter of all the lynchings that we documented of Black men are some violation of miscegenation laws. It can be anything from like in the case of Emmett Till, the violation of a social transgression, just speaking to a white woman, to allegations of crime. And I think that that presumption of guilt and the criminalization of Black people is something that we've seen carried through for generations and still burdens and colors the way in which our criminal justice system is carried out today. It's one of the reasons why why we think there is a link between the states with the highest numbers of racial terror lynchings and the states with the highest numbers of death sentences and executions today. This presumption of dangerousness and guilt informs how communities are policed. It informs how sentencing laws are carried out. And it helps to explain the disparities that we see not only in sentencing, but also in who gets incarcerated and how long and what that looks like. And so this historical context, there are some parts of it that seem far removed, but we are also seeing echoes of that carried out in very broad daylight. And we think about the case of, police killings or police involved killings, or also community members. When you think about Trayvon Martin and Ahmaud Arbery, and the ways in which community members, civilians, I should say, have made it their, have taken on this role of authority to carry out this type of violence that is still rooted and anchored in these histories of bias and neglect. And it's why we think and hope that if the more informed we become about the historical context and how it is connected to these systems of oppression, then we can begin to do the work of creating spaces for really meaningful truth telling that will hopefully create spaces for justice and accountability and repair and healing.
So within that context of justice, healing, art is a critical element for us as human beings in a society to, obviously, art can be beautiful, art speaks. Talk more, if you would, please, Ms. Collins, about, yes, you shared that you are originally from the state of Alabama. All of us are virtually in Alabama, but talk more about this intersectionality of my destiny is in your hands, the beautiful camellia flower, but yet it represents death, destruction for when within the context of lynching, murder, slavery.
Maybe I could mention a different work to put it in a different kind of context as well. Because this idea of like what art can do, a lot of that for me is looking through the archive and what feels really accurate and what we portray differently depending on who we are, like how things get remembered.
Yes.
And then what's just entirely absent and has fallen and is somehow silent or silenced. Felt like an Oprah move, silent or silenced. So right after the family separation crisis at the border, I found I think her name is Dr. Heather Williams' work, where she writes about these classified ads placed in Black newspapers of formerly enslaved people looking for their family members from like right before the end of the Civil War, sometimes up until the 1920s. It's an incredibly long time to be sending for me, they're kind of like who you were talking to, what name you might go by, where you might have lived, any kind of like identifying mark. And they're really small, but you send them out into the world, hoping that you might be reunited with your loved one. What was also nice about that archive was not everybody was getting the newspaper. And so a lot of times ministers would read them from the pulpit. It's another way that this like information keeps traveling and hopefully reuniting people. For me, though, that was about trying to understand that moment when we, or the administration at the time, chose to separate families, and understand it by looking at the past, and understand that it is a kind of reoccurring violence to separate family and to torture and inflict pain on family members by ripping them apart. But that's something we did during slavery as well. And that the past then makes the present make more sense, that you can at least trace the origins of something back to where it began. For me, that's a way in all of my artistic practice to make the present, it doesn't make sense, but to know the origins of a thing. The Birmingham News did something similar as well, thinking about archives. In 1963, during the spring campaign, they chose not to report on any civil rights stories, at least on their cover pages. If they reported it, it would like get buried inside. And then just stenographically, it's like facts and figures. Nobody who was involved was interviewed. So it's another way of thinking about, you know, the archive is our like treasure trove of language and history, and it's not always accurate. And so how do we help the viewer to rethink it, to show you like what might be missing, and then to rewrite the archive as well. That feels like a lot of what my practice is intended to do.
And so we each of us are representing different perspectives, if you will, of how we not only critique but take a personal as well as a expert, depending on our fields, look at lynching and how it still impacts. It is impacting our lives. So this is for everyone. What is it? Because we live in a world, a capitalistic world that's based around marketing and messaging and integrating the history as well as nature and art with the heinous crimes of lynching, What is it that we as a society, no matter how young or how mature in age, that we need to take into consideration for how we work against lynching, against murder, against racial terror today? What can you say to children, to members of society that we're still living in this moment of racial terror?
I think one of the things that it says is that we can't look past injustice. I think Dr. King was absolutely right when he said that injustice tolerated anywhere threatens justice everywhere. And so when it comes to juveniles being incarcerated with adults, we can't look past them. When it comes to prisoners being abused sexually and otherwise while they're in custody, we can't look past them. When a young person is injured or worse at the hands of the police, we can't look past them. We have to, Brian Stephen always talks about being proximate to the issue. I think, I think that's what we have to do as a society. It makes all of us uncomfortable, but I think that's the only way we're going to correct a lot of these injustices. We can't say that's their child, that's their problem. Ella's song, until the murder of Black boys means the same, and I'm paraphrasing, that the murder of white boys mean or resonates the same way, then all of us who believe in justice cannot rest. And I agree with that sentiment. We cannot rest. We can't look past these things. Because I think, if anything, it emboldens those who have dark hearts to continue these acts You know, we gotta be witnesses for these individuals. We have to speak for them when they can't speak for themselves. Bethany, you were talking about archives, and I think one of the things we have to do is we got to interrogate the sources. I mean, sometimes I wish I could bring the dead back, because, you know, one of the things, and I think this is just human nature, people don't always tell the truth. Right. You know, and so when you are in an archives and you're reading something, that's a version of the truth, but it may not be the truth. And you got to interrogate your sources. And so we have to do all of this work, I think. It requires, and there's something that we can all do to achieve this. And I think we just have to figure out what that is and do it. So that's my take.
Ms. Boone?
I agree with Dr. Moten, of course. We think about the historical context and the history as being really critical and central to, as Bethany put it, making sense of the present or contextualizing the present, but it also helps inform us of the ways in which we need to be working to interrupt these cycles to shape a different future, a more just future. Oftentimes in these spaces, we talk a lot about the need for truth and reconciliation. And at EJI, we strongly believe that truth and reconciliation, truth and justice, truth and healing, all of those things are sequential. We have to do the work of engaging and confronting with the truth. And that means looking to the historical context, looking into the archives, asking those questions about who has been controlling the archives, who's been controlling the dominant narrative, who has been telling those stories, who has been silent, what is missing, and then creating opportunities to add to that. We, in our research, definitely stand on the shoulders of Ida B. Wells and NAACP and the Crisis Magazine and Monroe Work and the Tuskegee Archives. But we've also been really fortunate to be able to sit down with community members and family members and to grab those stories and add them to the archive, that those oral histories and capture them. And hopefully they become things that we can continue to pass down and use as a lens of understanding and teasing out some of the ways in which the white press was very sympathetic to these mob violence and how they frame those stories, and finding ways to really help to explain the foundation for the ideology of white supremacy and the ways in which this presumption of dangerousness and guilt and the use of the carceral system itself to carry out this violence has been used. But when I speak to student groups and talk to folks, I'm definitely advocating for engaging in this truth telling and doing that in ways that are both big and small. And one of the reasons why we really encourage folks to get involved with the Community Remembrance Project and doing that on a local level and telling those stories and making those connections. And some of that is practical. When we talk about criminal justice reform as it looks today, so much of that work has to happen on the state level and the local level. If the federal government or the federal administration is doing things that are not problematic, that's really great. But the majority of the people who are incarcerated in jails and prisons in this nation are incarcerated in state facilities. And so we need to be creating space to really challenge and push our leaders in those areas. And by having this historical context of what has happened, it can help inform that. For Virginia, for example, that state has executed more people since the modern day death penalty was instated, other than Texas. That's saying a lot, Virginia compared to Texas. And that history of slavery and racial terror lynching and segregation and mass incarceration as it looks today, those are still battles that Virginia needs to continue to fight. But this is a monumental shift in what that can look like, and hopefully, eventually, what it can look like in other states and other Southern states as well. So that truth-telling piece is so central to us being able to get to the types of meaningful reforms that we need.
So within that truth telling, however, because we're dealing with reality here, and unfortunately, in preparation for our conversation, I started looking at the archives, if you will, in media, and there are persons who are voicing that if we start looking at lynchings of the past and try to connect them with present day killing of Black people or anybody who is not white, then we're just conjuring up trouble. What's your response to that?
I think that that is a response that is dismissive in ways that are not helpful to the actual conversation. It's like saying the reason why you're bleeding or in pain is because you're talking about the fact that you're bleeding. I was like, no, the reason why I'm bleeding is because I've been harmed, I've been cut, I've been injured. And so talking about it isn't the issue. The issue is that the injustice exists. And so by making these connections, it ensures that we are not putting a Band-Aid on something that's more serious. It allows for us to get to the root cause, or at least gets closer to the root cause of it, to make monumental shifts in how we think about it, as opposed to just kicking the can down the road.
Dr. Moten, Ms. Collins?
Yeah, I think about Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail. And, the white clergy who said, what is all this vitriol about segregation or whatever? Why are you making such a fuss about this? And I mean, and so anybody who wants to explain away these injustices, I would urge them to go and read Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail. Dr. King says many things in that letter, but one of the things he says is that I'm here because injustice is here. And so why do we talk about these things? Because we haven't fixed them, because they still happen. And because it causes people pain. My mother-in-law said that when the jury acquitted the person who killed Trayvon Martin, mother-in-law said it was like a death in our family. I mean, she felt that pain. My mother-in-law is 86 years old, and she felt that pain. And so, when we see George Floyd and we see that police officer bearing his weight on his neck, we felt that pain. Collectively, we felt that pain. So, no, we can't talk about this, and no, we're not going to stop talking about this. Because, I don't know of any major problem that has solved itself without some effort. And so, that's why we have journalists, that's why we have educators, that's why we have ministers, that's why we have public intellectuals and scholars and so on and so forth. So now I'm not of the mind that, somehow we make matters worse if we continue to talk about these issues. Because I don't believe that's true.
Ms. Collins?
Well, you know what the Birmingham News editorial board said about why they weren't publishing those stories. Civil rights movement stories gets flipped on us. So I am in agreement with Dr. Moten. It seems like a ridiculous argument. And we proved it then, and we keep proving it over and over again. Not talking about it doesn't do much.
Yeah. And so we're proving we have to talk about it. And what is in this proof, we also are now not only incorporating the archival work, but literally bodies are becoming a part of this archive. The language of descriptions of the riddling of bullets, from reaching back to Emmett Till's mother talking about the eyeball, hearing the descriptions of persons, the mother of Breonna Taylor, talking about how her daughter's body was riddled. So what do we do with this language? How does this language assist us? I mean, even for the fact that the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts would connect Bethany Collins' artwork and bring it into the public domain conversation, not just for us to walk around virtually, to walk around the museum, or even to visit her exhibit virtually, but how does this intersectionality of art, language, rhetoric, truth, lies, how does this help the conversation? How does this help justice? Does it help justice?
Was that for me? That one was for me.
It's open. Yes.
That one was open.
And so if you
I think my job is to like find the most essential visual form to say all of these things, to point out the discrepancy in the archive or where we have lied about the past, and to bring that into the present in a way that, though you might not read about it, the visual makes it inescapable. I think that's my job, is to make it as inescapable as possible. And sometimes to use beauty to do that, to seduce you into the work until you cannot escape what the meaning behind the work. But I also remember seeing the soil samples at EJI. My sister interned there a long time ago. And I think EJI also has the kind of heart of an artist. The soil sample wall is evidence of that. And the museum and the monuments are evidence of that. And I'm interested to hear, I think part of that work is that part of those monuments are taken back to other counties. So they're kind of, they're made to memorialize, and then they're released back into the world in that kind of make it inescapable, make that confrontation inescapable for people. And I'm interested to hear if that's been successful. And I don't know what successful means, if people have done it.
We definitely, with the sites especially, have tried to find ways to leverage the talent of artists to help make this history and the links to the present and even the contemporary experience tangible for people. When people enter the museum and the memorial, we want it to be affirming of the lived experience that so many people have gone through with these very challenging parts of our country's story. But we also need them to be educational. We need them to be able to tap into people's hearts and minds. We want to be able to leave them with something, move them in ways in which they hadn't been moved, and getting them to ask questions that they maybe hadn't been asking before, or and we really want to animate people. And I think that's where art, whether it be song or sculpture or the ways in which we take language and the environment around us to create a different story, can be really powerful. And what I like about your components of your exhibit and the use of the flowers and the floral arrangements is that these are things that have always been a part of the landscape. In the same way that the soil piece, like one of the motivations for the soil was this idea that the physical landscape, the built environment, to use the architecture language I learned, the built environment might change, and it has changed over decades and generations, but there's something sacred about the land, or something sacred about this environment that has always been there, that has existed through the highs and lows of this history. And by capturing that soil from those communities, it's one way of capturing just a piece of something that has always been something that was present at the time that this occurred, and something that is present when communities are coming together to engage in this act of truth-telling about it. The call to action with the duplicate memorial monuments is something that we wanted to happen. We always knew that we wanted that to be a part of it, especially as we started seeing the power of the soil collection experience. Professor Moten knows, because he was one of our very early participants in that project. But we also recognized that there was something to be said about having the memorial in Alabama, having it in Montgomery, but still being connected to these narratives and stories of so many parts of the country, and wanting it to be in dialogue and conversation with those spaces. We did not anticipate the way in which the response would come. There was a lot of enthusiasm for, let us claim it, we're ready to do this. But we recognize that the symbolism of the monuments is only powerful if the consciousness of the community has been raised about this history, about these local narratives. And so we haven't yet released any duplicate monuments, but the work that communities have been doing through the soil collection, through the narrative markers, through the essay contest, through the programming has been really powerful. And I think that we are seeing this consciousness raised. People now know more names of lynching victims, they know more connections, so that when something happens today, they have something, an intellectual hook to call back to, and that is the intangible consequence of this work that has just been really exciting and encouraging for me. I don't know, John, if that answered your first question, but.
Yes, you are. And with that said, I would like to hear from Dr. Moten. So we hear about the sacred soil and the intricacy and the interconnectedness of nature, of art, and that brings to mind Africanisms, if you will, in terms of culture, our connectivity to taking us back to the continent of Africa, and how due to slavery that we are scattered, our bodies are scattered around the diaspora, from the continent to the new world that is now called the United States, to Brazil, the South America, Caribbean, where indigenous people live, but yet we are still connected by these lynchings, these murders on sacred souls. Can you talk more about unpack that historically, and what does that mean for, because I like to add, humanity started, according to anthropologists, on the continent of Africa. Civilization started there.
Well, for me, one of the ways in which I think about this is that the racial terror that is chronicled and displayed at the Legacy Museum and the Memorial for Peace and Justice happened around the world to people of color, particularly folks who were taken by force from Africa or the African continent. And so while we may not have had lynchings occurring in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century, we certainly had racial terror occurring during these centuries, and people were brutalized in this whole process. There was nothing benign about slavery or enslavement. And so that's one way in which I think about this. Another way that I think about this is, I'm happy that you said something, or you referred to the diaspora, because only about 5% of enslaved Africans ended up in what became the United States of America. Mm-hmm. The other 95% are scattered throughout the Caribbean, throughout Central America, throughout South America. And so from my point of view, if we really want to understand what it means to be both African and American, we have to understand what happened to the 95%, not what happened to the 5%. Actually, we have to understand what happened to the 100%, but we certainly have to understand what happened to the 95%. So that's another way in which I think about this. The other way in which I think about this is that one of my favorite movies is Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust.
Yes.
And the matriarch of that movie says something to her son, that just resonates with me. She said, "It is up to the living to keep the memory of the dead alive." I think this is what EJI has done with the memorial. This is what EJI has done with the Legacy Museum. This is what I think we at Alabama State University attempt to do, with our museums and our displays. It's what I attempt to do with my own research. And that's our charge, to keep the memory of the dead alive. And so because as long as their memories are alive in us, they live. And again, to go back to something that I said earlier, we should never forget, never.
We should never forget. And I want you to tease out more, if you don't mind, each of you. And Ms. Collins, I'm going to start with you because I really, it's amazing. It obviously didn't happen by chance that you were led to take a more critical look at what does the camellia for Alabama represent within the context of that theme. My destiny is in your hands. How do we use that theme within? We know about we are all descendants of slavery because this country is founded on slavery. How do we live that out within the context of being equity seekers, justice seekers? And this is for everyone, but I'll start with Ms. Collins.
I mean, I think I often think the more practical work, the more immediate work is the charge of, and is something that Dr. Moten and Kiara are doing, right? My work, my visual work, I'm not an activist, I am the visual artist. My work is going to go into the museum. But I do think my charge is a little bit what I mentioned before, is to do the research and then to make visible what has been unseen. Like that I can do. The camellia for me, I find myself in Chicago, especially in the winters, missing home. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that I will live in Alabama again. And so what do you do with that kind of attention when you miss a place? You long for a place that you that won't be home again, right? It's just now exists in memory. And so I can call it back, and I, from a distance, can write a poem. I can write a kind of love letter to Alabama from a distance. And then I can also mention the work of those who are doing more immediate research and the kind of practical ways of making justice manifest. I can mention those bodies of research in my work as well. That feels like what I can do on the daily.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ms. Boone.
Yeah, we think learning is an action step. We think learning is an action item, and it's something that all of us can do and should do repeatedly. And we have a lot of resources to help in that, especially as we talk about our exposure to this history of slavery and racial terror, lynching and segregation and mass incarceration, and how those eras are connected, especially around the historical pieces. And there are organizations in all of our communities that are on the ground doing this work in a lot of different spaces. And we all have some type of talent, whether we see ourselves as educators or as artists or lawyers, doctors. However, there's space to get involved to interrupt these cycles of oppression and abuse. And the more informed we are, the more meaningful our actions can be. And when we do that in the community, there's something powerful that can happen when we are working together. So I really encourage people to do the learning, to invite others to do learning with them, and to have that inform the action items that they take and how they hold people who are currently in positions of authority accountable to all of us.
Thank you. Dr. Moten.
Well, I think that history is not serendipitous. When I think about the Second Amendment, if you go back and look at the history of the Second Amendment, it is clear, at least from my point of view, that there was an interest in arming some people and keeping other people disarmed. There was an interest in painting some folks as a threat to the community, and a threat that needed to be protected. And I would argue that those sentiments have not gone away. That there are people who still believe that they need to have whatever they need to have in their homes to protect their families. It was no accident, I believe, that the former president of the United States said publicly, that Mexican men were coming to America to rape our women. And I thought, wow, this is really, really amazing. Not only could he make that statement publicly, but he actually could make that statement publicly, and he wasn't assailed from one end of this country to the other. And I just imagine, or as my friends in Jamaica would say, imagine, what would have happened if 44 had said that statement. And so I think about it in that regard. And I know Bethany is fond of looking at dictionaries. And so one of the things I require my students to do is to look up the word Negro. And I require them to know the definition of Negro. And many of them think it's silly. So why are we doing this? We know what a Negro is. And I'm thinking, like, do you really know what a Negro is? And so many of them are surprised to learn that at one time Negroes were defined not only by their physical characteristics, because I think everybody expects that. I think the recent conversation that Oprah had with the Duchess and Duke of Sussex gave us a whole new understanding of this whole thing about Negro-ness. But the other part of the definition of Negro that I think is really telling is that Negroes are defined based on their physical characteristics without regard to language or culture. And so I go back to what I said initially, that history is not serendipitous. Somebody, these people were mad geniuses, thought, okay, so we're going to create a definition of race. And we're going to say that that definition sticks, whether or not you're born in Port-au-Prince, whether or not you're born in Brazil, whether or not you're born in Mexico City, or whether or not you're born in Montgomery, Alabama. That's genius. That's our history.
And with that said, this is why, and I end before I return our discussion to Ms. Cavness. This is why, quoting Ida B. Wells, we have to be intentional and remember that the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. in art, in education, in history, in everyday life. Thank you all.
Thank you, panelists. This has been such a powerful, powerful conversation, and unfortunately timely, but it is definitely something that is needed in our country to talk about these issues. And so one of the things that Ms. Boone had just said was that she invites people to do the learning and to have other people do the learning with them, right? And one of the things that our director of the Montgomery Museum of Arts is fond of saying is, you know, not only do you need to do the learning, but you also need to do the work, right? And so I think it's twofold. Like, we have to have this fundamental understanding and historical context in order to be informed. But I also think there's that second step, that call to action to actually go ahead and do the work to help us right these wrongs, right? And so in thinking of that, it really makes me appreciative of all of the artists that are, you know, working today, that are taking it upon themselves to do the work and to show us what it is that is happening, and to be our truth tellers, and to be the people that are shining the light on some of these injustices and things that have been silenced for far too long. And one of the questions that I just kind of think about is, if artists are going to be our truth tellers, our storytellers, what do you think, or how do you hope that people coming up, our younger generation, our younger artists, prepare to do this work? I'll launch that to Bethany.
Probably by getting the syllabi from Dr. Moten and Dr. Harrell, because I feel like most of what I research in my practice, I didn't hear much about in like my primary school education, my K through 12 education. It's a lot of reading. And then I hope that they feel free to make the work that they want and need to make. And it's sometimes, I did a talk with Derek Adams maybe last week, and we talked a lot about, I talked about this work, which is work about a history of rooted in American history. And Derek then talked about work that was about showing Black people at leisure and at rest and at play, and in pleasure. And I feel like both of those things, and he said this, are very much necessary, that showing us in our full spectrum of life is incredibly necessary and useful and needed. Like we need all of those things. So I hope they make the work that feels most crucial to them.
I agree. I think for us at the museum, we are constantly encouraging students to engage in creating art, because oftentimes children are not maybe well-versed enough to express these complex ideas and complex feelings through verbalization or through the written word. And so I think art allows a space for children to be able to kind of process what is happening around them, process the history of our nation, and help to kind of work it out through that medium. So I completely agree. And I do agree that I think doing a lot of reading and research is critical in doing any type of racial justice work, whether it's going to be through art or advocacy work, or if you're teaching it, you have to do your research and you have to read. Another question that came into us is someone was curious about the process by which people come and pick up the duplicates that then go into the counties, Kiara? And how does that work? And also, is there a way in which, you know what, I'll save that question because that could be for Dr. Moten, because I know he's worked on this. So I'll stick with that one for right now.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one that we get a lot, especially after people have had a chance to stand in the memorial monument and be surrounded by the totality of what it feels like to have all those monuments and those names there. The process is a part of our Community Remembrance Project. You can read more about it on our website, and we just released a new brochure catalog that sort of highlights different ways in which communities have been and are doing this work, and what we hope this call to action motivates, which is exactly this: learning and doing the work. We really want the symbolism of the monument to be surrounded by raised consciousness of not only the local history and victims of racial terror lynching, but those broader connections to history that predates racial terror eras and history that postdates it as well, and creating space for communities to really think meaningfully about making those connections. And in the work that we've been doing with communities so far, we've seen some really powerful things happen, and it's really encouraging to see how those conversations have happened over the past few years, how our project is a continuation of work that community members have always been doing, and for some communities, how it's introduced an opportunity to think a little bit differently. So the process is really anchored in this Community Remembrance Project, this process of engaging and educating people in the community of all ages. That's why the curriculum and the high school essay contests are really crucial parts of that, because we do want to create an intergenerational conversation, but also providing educators with tools and assets to bring that curriculum into the classrooms, but also finding ways through film screenings and book discussions and panel discussions like this one, and local exhibits at the museums and libraries, to make this history as accessible to as many people as possible, so that you don't have to be a historian or a lawyer, but you can begin to see the connections, and the questions that we pose to visitors at the museum when they leave are intended to say, we just, you went through this whole experience about this history and these connections from slavery to mass incarceration. We want you to be motivated to action. We want you to start asking some of these questions, maybe new questions. And the Community Remembrance Project is one way that commitment to not forgetting and to never again can be actualized. And we hope that work will manifest itself in more of these intangibles, but also the tangible projects of soil, marker, essay contests, and eventually the placement of these monuments, so that symbolism has meaning.
Thank you. One of the things you mentioned was markers, and that was the second part of that question. How many markers have you guys been, has EJI been involved in Alabama?
That's a good question. I'm going to count. Yeah, okay. A little less than a dozen, well, maybe right at a dozen, especially if you count our markers in Montgomery about the domestic slave trade. But there is a list on our website of all the communities where we've done these markers. Our very first lynching marker was in 2015 in Brighton, Alabama, which is a little bit north, I think it's north, or a little bit outside of Birmingham. And our most recent was in Irondale, Alabama.
And Dr. Moten, can you talk a little bit about the process of getting a historical marker up in a city? I know that you've been a part of that process for different ones.
Well, I think it matters from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. In Montgomery, if you want to do it through the Historical Society, there are certain rules and guidelines that you need to follow, but essentially anybody can create a historical marker. We created one recently on our campus to commemorate the 100th anniversary of World War I. And that marker pays tribute to 5 students from Alabama State University who graduated from the Fort Des Moines Negro Officers Training School, which was the first Black officers training school created in the United States. And so that people understand, or our viewers understand the context here, prior to the Fort Des Moines Negro Officers Training School, there were only 3 Black officers in the United States Army. As a result of that officers training school, once that the one and only class graduated, there were an additional 639 Black officers in the United States Army. One of those officers was Robert Abbott, who was the founder of the Chicago Defender, where Ida B. Wells wrote and was a reporter. And so, you know, the only thing that we had to pay attention to, I shouldn't say the only thing, but the thing that we had to pay attention to when we created our historical marker was the historical accuracy that was on the marker. And of course, you know, with these markers, you pay pretty much by the word. And so you don't want to be too verbose because that could be pretty expensive. But you want to make sure that you get all the facts and to the extent that you can. There are a lot more markers I think should go up, denoting all sorts of history, local history, not only in Alabama, but across the country. This debate about Confederate monuments and so forth, I've always believed that, you know, there should be monuments on every historically Black college. And there are 105 or 103, excuse me. And so, you know, if we don't like the markers that some other folks or monuments that some other folks have put up, we can put up our own. And we can put them on the campuses of historically Black colleges and universities. I think this work is really important, and I think more and more people are beginning to look at this work as important because they want to leave something behind, I think, for the generations that come on afterwards to understand how, you know, what happened in this space and why what happened in this space was really important.
Thank you, Dr. Moten. You had talked about language, and I think that's a good segue for our last question. Dr. Harrell, can you talk a little bit about language and rhetoric in terms of lynching, both past and present, and how has that really kind of played out in the media, especially?
Do we have enough time?
Well, the abridged version, I guess.
Wow. First and foremost, language is the tool for by purchasing bodies, for oppressing bodies, for power, for influence, for lies. And I'm listing those words specifically because it is the power of language that we find ourselves in this space within the context of colonialism, slavery, brutalization, lynching, murder. And so therefore, unfortunately, because of the need for power and control, then language has become a weapon. And a weapon in the sense that if language, I'm going to speak historically, the language that the Black body could not have been created by God, that was introduced by Carl Linus, who was a botanist, an anthropologist, and a medical doctor. And so because of the need for control and for power, then his language, his description of bodies, saying that, and because he was a son, he grew up in Sweden, and his father was a Lutheran minister. And so therefore he started, historically, he started this language of this using language as a weapon against bodies that did not look like the European body. And so that started this process of, as Dr. Moten spoke of earlier, in terms of this system wherein what gave these persons the right, not the right, but why the ingenious, I think he used the word genius. How did they come up with this genius concept that we could, these are my words now, present language that would degrade human bodies because the skin color was different, the body makeup was different, because those bodies, if you believe in God, those bodies were created by God to live in certain geographical climates. But this language was presented by Carl Linus and then was accepted by Pope Nicholas V. At that time, he was a ruler of the Catholic Church. And so therefore the Catholic Church, if you will, the Pope of the Catholic Church. And so therefore that language as a weapon started to be used as a weapon against the race language. That was the introduction of race language, of differentiating, because of the Black body looks different from the European body, if you will. And so that is the beginning of, and that just, we fast forward to the descriptions of using the dictionary of what Negro, the definition of Negro is. And so this is why we have to be very intentional in teaching our children from, and this is why it's very exciting that I have one of his books here. Professor Kendi even has a book about how to be anti-racist for children that you can read to babies, because language, racist language is a weapon. And so therefore, this is why we have to be very intentional about teaching the meaning of words, the etymology, the original meaning of the words, and teaching children how society, because of the need for power and control, how that impacts changing the language and using language that language becomes a weapon. And a quick example, a short example of that, immediate example, is how tonight we've been talking about the history of lynching. And here we are representing various disciplines, but simultaneously, we have representatives in the United States government, Congressman Roy, the former president, and yet they can use the same racist language to tell a different narrative. And so this is why it it is imperative that we begin as early as possible to teach our children how to read and to critically think, as well as intersect their learning with history, the entire history. Otherwise, this racist system of lynching, we're being lynched mentally, I believe, as well as physically. And so therefore, rhetoric will not, the racist rhetoric language will always be used as a weapon of mass destruction, as long as we do not have action to fight against it. And that includes, we have to begin teaching our children how to fight back as soon as possible, using language, knowing their history, knowing the truthful history.
Thank you, Dr. Harrell. That is really important, I think, for people to understand, is that it's never too early to start this conversation with our children, to help them understand and contextualize the world in which they live, so that they can better navigate and better advocate for a more just world that we all hope for one day. And on that note, you had talked about making sure that people are critically thinking, children are critically thinking. And that's something that I really hope this conversation tonight has allowed some people to do that viewed it, and allows people who are going to view it later on our YouTube channel to do, is to think critically about these topics and these issues that we've brought up surrounding lynching, but really surrounding our history and surrounding our current climate. And how can they take what they learn here in this conversation and apply it to their lives, or apply it to what they, how they view the world, right? So that's really something that I hope that our conversation tonight has kind of sparked in our audience. And I just want to take a moment and thank all of our panelists and our moderator tonight for this wonderful, wonderful conversation and enlightening facts and figures, and often disturbing, but things that are definitely needed to be shared. So again, thank you, Dr. Harrell, thank you, Ms. Boone, thank you, Ms. Collins, and thank you, Dr. Moten, for your participation in tonight's panel. Thank you to everyone who watched this discussion tonight. I know it was a little longer than you're used to for our typical creative conversation, but there's just so much to unpack and so much to talk about on this topic. We thought it was well worth the 2 hours. And I just want to encourage everyone to continue to engage and continue to learn, and in a variety of ways. And for the museum, we host these creative conversations every month, and we have another one upcoming April 21st, 5:30 p.m. And that one will be talking about our new exhibition that's outdoors. It's called A Stroll with Shakespeare, Boydell and the Bard. And it will be talking about the way in which we created that exhibition, but also why was that exhibition important, and to really kind of give some people some insight into that whole experience, because there's also an audio tour that goes along with the exhibition. And I think what's really interesting about that particular exhibition is that we worked and partnered with Alabama Shakespeare Festival and got some actors to do some scenes. And so I think it's going to be really powerful. And again, it continues that narrative and that conversation of continuing to learn and engage in a variety of ways and a variety of manners and topics. So I encourage you to tune in again on April 21st at 5:30 for our next creative conversation. And before I sign off and before we end tonight, I just want to thank our sponsor, Alabama Humanities Foundation. They were able to give us some funding for this program so that we could share all of this wonderful information with you tonight. So again, just thank you to Alabama Humanities Foundation, a state partner with the National Endowment for the Humanities, and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.